This is the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser. Markets, finance, scandal. Yes, the world has changed since the election of Barack Obama. Let's take a look at some of the changes we've seen. Here's an interesting video I'd like to play for you. It's about how the Taliban is being financed by the Americans.
Welcome back to the Ed Show. The American taxpayers, that would be you and me, we are funding terrorism, believe it or not. An explosive new report in The Nation details how U.S. tax dollars are going to pay off Taliban killers to keep them from bombing and shooting at U.S. convoys. Basically, the Pentagon pays the contractors to provide security. The contractors buy security by greasing the hands of the Taliban thugs. The Taliban, kind of like the mafia, they run everything in Afghanistan.
That's right. America, the financing geniuses of the world. Wall Street, the citadel of capitalism, now financing the Taliban. Soon to be traded on the New York Stock Exchange. Symbol T-A-L, Taliban. It's hot. It's an IPO. Goldman's doing the underwriting. You got to buy it on the opening. It's going higher. Well, yes, capitalism is eating itself in America. Good example of this might be this little story. I see, reported to us from ABC News, that McDonald's is hiring in Guantanamo Bay. That's right, McDonald's is opening in Guantanamo Bay. That's right, while you're being tortured, you can eat a nice Big Mac. Your fingernails are being ripped out and you're being waterboarded while you're enjoying a nice chicken McNuggets. Yes, McDonald's is now hiring in Guantanamo Bay. A lot of change has happened since Barack Obama has been president of the United States. What else is happening out there in the big bad universe of Barack Obama and change? Oh, here's some change. General Electric, world's biggest, I guess what do you want to call it, a military contractor? They plan to spend $1 billion creating new Islamic bonds. That's right. Sharia law, which is the law of Islam, has guided the Islamic banks through this financial crisis beautifully. They're not going bankrupt like on Wall Street. So General Electric, they're going to start selling bonds using Sharia law. More change we can believe in. Let's go to some of the other big stories this week here in the Keiser Report. We turn now to correspondent, financial commentator, Stacy Herbert. Stacy, welcome to the Keiser Report.
Max, nice to be here. I do have some headlines. You know, Barack Obama is in Asia on a 9-day tour of Asia, including Japan, Singapore, China, and South Korea. Here's the scandal that was erupted in the United States following this photo. This is Barack Obama greeting the Emperor of Japan. As you see, he's bowing quite deeply. I think this shows you just how desperate the financial situation is in America.
Well, it's better than Bush when he was in China. Didn't he throw up on the guy?
Yeah, that was George Bush the first, yes?
Yeah.
Well, some people do point out that it's better than this picture of George Bush Jr. greeting Angela Merkel. Remember, he gave her a back rub.
Oh, my, yeah. Scared the dickens out of her. Scared the bratwurst out of her.
Well, from Japan, Obama then went to China. And on his flight there, while he was flying there, about to arrive in Shanghai, here are the headlines. China rounds on U.S. Rates as global economic risk. China's Liu says U.S. rates cause dollar speculation. And China, loose U.S. policy, weak U.S. dollar creating speculation. So, you know, Obama and Timothy Geithner have been complaining about the yuan, and one of their goals in going to China was that they were trying to encourage the Chinese to stop intervening in the currency market. So while they're flying there, before Obama even arrives, the chairman of the China Banking Regulatory Commission, Lu Mingkang, warned of a new systemic risk being caused by the U.S. dollar, weak dollar policy.
It's currency wars. This is World War III. It can be fought in the currency pits around the world, with these countries throwing S&P futures contracts and Forex contracts at each other, with algorithmic trading and high-frequency trading versus various bankers and the public. It's currency wars. World War III. Chinese bankers, they're no less corrupt than U.S. bankers.
Well, Mr. Liu blames the U.S. dollar and the low interest rates, which the Federal Reserve Bank has just recently promised their rates will basically stay at near zero for the next 12 to 18 months. So this is encouraging the dollar carry trade. And Mr. Liu and also Donald Tsang, the chief executive of Hong Kong, are warning that the Americans are causing a global financial bubble, not dissimilar to the one we just went through that was caused by Japan's low interest rates.
Interest rates are not going up anywhere. That would be like some casino in Las Vegas making it easier for people to win at the roulette table. It's not going to happen. Interest rates favor savers and capital formation and capitalism. But we're beyond capitalism. We're in casino gulag speculationism. There is no more capitalism. No, interest rates are never going higher. They're only staying low. We're going lower.
That brings me to the next headline. America is an over-indebted, profligate, spoiled nation in decline.
And your point?
This is Henry Blodgett interviewing Charles Ortel of Newport Value Partners. And he's just explaining that his investment strategy for his clients is to to buy credit default swaps on U.S. debt.
Right.
So
Right.
he thinks the credit default swaps are presently trading at 25 basis points. Mm-hmm. And he reckons they'll go higher as people get worried about the huge amounts of debt being created in order to bail out bankers.
Sure. Henry Blodgett. I mean, he's right. He's always right. Even Amazon.com will eventually go to $400 a share, Henry Blodgett. Eventually, he'll be right on that, too. Yeah, credit default swaps. I see that there's a huge speculation in the credit default swaps, which is kind of like the global casino market that gives countries and individuals and hedge funds the ability to sell short other countries and other populations and democracy and freedom everywhere for their own personal gain. The spreads are telling us that Japan is looking mighty weak these days. The UK is looking weak. Apparently Japan is the next one to go the route of Iceland.
Yes, and credit default swaps on German debt is actually trading lower than on U.S. debt. So that Germany has a less likely chance of defaulting than the U.S. So at 25 basis points on American debt, that means it costs $25,000 to insure against $10 million in bonds.
That's right. Well, Germany is a country that has a huge manufacturing base, great export markets, good fiscal policies, and lots of gold. Lots and lots of gold. And they'll probably, from what I understand, Stacy Herbert, Germany is going to announce that they're buying more gold. Because you've got India buying gold, China buying gold, Germany feels left out. Their Bundesbank, and we have good connections at the Bundesbank. You know, we were over there talking to them at the Bundesbank in Frankfurt. We hear that Bundesbank's going to be buying more gold in the open market.
Well, so the previous headline said that America's an over-indebted, profligate, spoiled nation. But I also think the next headline show it's actually a very deeply corrupt nation. And that's probably a bigger problem than being a profligate, spoiled nation. Borofsky says TARP almost certainly will bring loss.
Who is Borofsky again?
Borofsky says TARP almost certainly will bring loss to U.S. Now, Neil Borofsky, of course, is the Special Treasury Department Inspector General overseeing the Troubled Asset Relief Program. Oh, yes. This was the $700 billion that Henry Paulson managed to extract from the U.S. Congress.
Suicide banker, yes.
In order to buy troubled assets. Mm. Well, this is a quote he felt
Troubled bonuses.
Borofsky felt necessary to say this. When I first took office, I can't tell you how many times I'd be having a sit-down and warning about potential fraud in the program. And I would hear a response basically saying, oh, they're bankers, and they wouldn't put their reputations at risk by committing fraud.
They're suicide bankers. And of course they're going to blow themselves and the economy up because they don't know no different. This is the change we all voted for. Suicide bankers running the economy. Yippee!
But also, you know, it goes with that green shoots theme where Americans are being told constantly that everything is going to be better. And part of the way that Hank Paulson and now Obama has been able to take so much money from the U.S. taxpayers that they're going to make money magically on this. And Borofsky's having to tell the population, well, actually, you're going to lose money. That's more likely that you'll lose.
We'll give them a nice party favor on their way out to the gulag, and they'll feel happy.
So now we have the situation where the bankers, we know, have profited greatly from their own collapse.
Oh, yeah.
And the final headline takes me to this. Home builders, you heard that right, get a gift. So last week, President Obama signed the Worker, Home Ownership, and Business Assistance Act of 2009.
Ka-ching! More change!
It's meant to extend unemployment benefits by 20 weeks and renewing the first-time homebuyer tax credit until next April. But tucked away inside the law is another prize for home builders, a tax break that lets big companies offset losses incurred in 2008 and 2009 against profits booked as far back as 2004. So all during that housing bubble generated by fraudulent bonds from banks and also fraudulent loans from home builders, well, they're going to be able to actually take back huge amounts of taxes that they paid on that.
I'll tell you why that is true, Stacy Herbert, because these home builders, like Goldman Sachs, are doing God's work. Stacy Herbert, thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report. When we come back from the break, Danny Schechter, the news dissector.
The only European country which abolished the communist regime with violent clashes and executed the leader. Has their goal been reached? And does Romania have any future in the European community? Romanian Revolt on RT.
Every month we give you the future. We help you understand how we'll get there and what tomorrow will bring. The best in science and technology from across Russia and around the world. Join us for Technology Update on RT.
Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Pretty soon we're going to be talking with Danny Schechter, the news dissector. He's made a new film called Plunder. He's got a new book out called The Crime of Our Time, all about the financial no-goodniks there on Wall Street committing all kinds of financial crimes and malfeasance. But I want, perhaps, to take a look back from a very special vantage point. I want to look back from the future. 5 years from now, 10 years from now, when people talk about what happened to America, why did it collapse? Why did they let those crooks on Wall Street take down the entire economy? They're going to look at this little piece of film from a PBS special about a woman who was assigned to regulate the titanically and preposterously corrupt guys on Wall Street, who was pushed back by none other than the arch criminal of the century, Alan Easy Money Greenspan, who, without a doubt, is responsible for hollowing out the U.S. economy, putting billions into the pockets of the top 1%, massive unemployment, deindustrialization, and now the de-dollarization around the world as the U.S. dollar becomes basically nothing more than Warren Buffett's toilet paper. Let's check out a little bit of this clip right now.
An experienced financial litigator who'd seen the worst of the markets, Bourne was a believer in government regulation. Given the political climate in Washington at the time, clashes with Greenspan, Rubin, and Summers were inevitable.
Clashes with Greenspan, Rubin, and Summers, the three horsemen of the financial apocalypse. Greenspan, I've mentioned already. Larry Summers, he's one of these clowns that have been working in the shadows for the most part. He's an apologist for failed neoliberal policies. He's in the Obama administration. Obama didn't get rid of this guy. He's still active, like a bad virus. Rubin, of course, Robert Rubin, ex-Goldman Sachs, ex-Treasury Secretary, ex-Citigroup board member who oversaw the total calamitous collapse of that company, the birth of hundreds of billions and trillions of false derivatives contracts that have no possibility of ever being repaid, thus causing the next major crisis, the currency crisis, the dollar crisis. Anyway, these three guys, the three horsemen of the financial apocalypse, they're still around basically in their cloned version. You've got Geithner, you've got Bernanke, who are the clones, if you will, of the three mentioned here, Greenspan, Rubin, and the third guy.
Almost right away, she had one. It began after she received an invitation to lunch at the Federal Reserve. with the chairman himself.
How could you not have a little bit of butterflies in your stomach when you're going to go see Alan Greenspan at that moment in time?
It didn't take long for Bourne to learn that she and the chairman were not going to see eye to eye.
He said something to the effect of, well, Brooksley, we're never going to agree on fraud. And she said, well, what do you mean? And he said, you probably think there should be rules against it. She said, well, yes, I do. He said, you know, I think the market will figure it out.
Okay, now, this is a documented piece of evidence. Alan Greenspan, the Fed chairman, is lobbying for fraud. Fraud is the basic operating system of the U.S. economy. The specialist system on the floor of the stock exchange has fraud hardwired into it. All the accounting methodologies of all the banks and all the corporations have fraud hardwired into it. Nobody is addressing the problem that in the U.S., fraud is the business model du jour of the billionaire class. Nobody wants to upset the billionaires for fear that they might unsettle the possibility that they themselves can become a fraudulent billionaire. It's the greatest scam in history because you've got millions and millions of people in the U.S. who, like Bernie Madoff's clients, know that there's a problem, but like the fact that they're getting these dividends from fraud until it blows up, then they want to get bailed out.
Well, I think she was taken aback about how far he would go towards deregulation, that even the notion that we should police fraudulent activity he didn't think was something that was a given.
That's right. Fraud is not an ideology, it's a crime. How about that for a bumper sticker? Remember that Reagan bumper sticker, just say no? You know, remember that whole don't do drugs thing? How about don't do fraud? Fraud, it's a crime, not an ideology. I'd like to see that bumper sticker in Washington, D.C., and around the world, and around America. Let's turn to Danny Schechter, author of this book, this book, The Crime of Our Time. He's also the creator of a film that's now out and available. It's called Plunder, The Crime of Our Time. We're going to play a clip from this film right now before talking with Danny. Roll tape.
I followed up with a book that came out before Lehman Brothers went bankrupt. Speaking on Wall Street, I called for a jailout, not a bailout.
I used to think of Wall Street as a financial center. I now think of it as a crime scene.
Now it's time to make the case for why the financial crisis is a crime story. And I'm not the only one who sees it this way. Nomi Prinz was a managing partner at Bear Stearns and Goldman Sachs.
This is the most expensive takeout, the biggest crime in world history. We're talking about a crime we can't even quantify. You're talking double-digit trillions of dollars minimum.
This film will explore the scale of monies missing, written off, lost, ripped off in these various scams, and in the case of the bailout funds, unaccounted for.
Like millions of Americans, I've lost thousands of dollars in retirement funds, and I haven't had it as bad as many. It's not just about them. It's about me, too. I have a stake in it, and like millions, I'm angry about the way our economy was wrecked.
Danny, welcome to the Keiser Report.
Pleasure to be with you.
First, tell us, in your opinion, what caused the economic calamity?
Well, I see a trend over years, first of all, of a small elite dominating our economy and dominating decision-making, financialization, of the economy itself, so that a credit and loan complex began to dominate in the same way that a military-industrial complex dominated in earlier times. But then these people began to create a criminal scheme, which hasn't really been acknowledged as such, based on massive predatory mortgage fraud, securitization, and the misrepresentation of the value of so-called mortgage bundles of various kind that was sold around the world based on phony ratings, and then insurance schemes that enabled them to leverage on the basis of all of this and make a fortune, putting millions of families at risk, and as we see now, 14 million families facing foreclosure. So all of this was done with tremendous irresponsibility, a lack of regulation, a lack of oversight, and in fact complicity by our media and the government.
Tell us about some of the most shocking predatory practices you discovered while investigating the crime of the century.
Well, you know, in 2004, the FBI warned of what they called a mortgage epidemic, an epidemic of mortgage fraud. But they were unable to investigate it because they had been downsized. Their corporate crime-fighting units became part of the war on terror. And as a result, there was very little investigation going on of these practices other than some warnings, which did not go heeded, you know, until many, many years later when all of this started collapsing around us. So I think the biggest shock of it all was that the inability of the system to see what it was doing, to do anything about it, to investigate, and now to prosecute. So the failure to prosecute these criminals grows out of a failure to regulate them and investigate them.
Danny, how can you have an economic catastrophe, as you call it, but aside from Bernie Madoff, no one's going to jail for this stuff? The financial criminals have not faced justice.
Well, Bernie Madoff, of course, had nothing to do with this particular financial crisis, really, other than, you know, because of it, he wasn't able to keep his Ponzi scheme going. But Bernie Madoff is a kind of a symbol, you know, of an era, of a time when somebody could get away with, you know, a $50 to $65 billion scheme that went on for 20 years without anybody acknowledging it. And he was one of the so-called market makers. He was considered the big fish in the market world, and he played to that very well as the chairman of NASDAQ and as the head of his own investment fund, tied into so-called feeder funds of people bringing in money, knowing, many of them, these investors knowing that, or believing that Bernie had insider contacts, had insider connections, and therefore they would get a higher return because, in fact, he was manipulating the market. So the people who were involved with him, who were portrayed as victims in many cases, knew exactly what they were doing. They just didn't know that they would be victimized.
But Danny, isn't fraud the entire system in America?
That's a very good point. If you go back to the writings of John Kenneth Galbraith on the Great Depression, he speaks in terms of corporate larceny. There was a Pecora commission that investigated the crash of 29, concluding that all these schemes and scams had helped drive it, that the speculation fervor of the time was driven by criminal activity of various kinds. But those lessons were not heeded. And the current financial industry essentially deregulated its own marketplace. They got rid of the laws that required disclosure and accountability and all the rest of it. So there was nobody minding the store or watching what these guys did, and they were able to rationalize and justify it in a so-called shadow banking system. So they were operating in the shadows. The government allowed them to do it. The FBI didn't investigate. The SEC was asleep at the switch. And of course the media, you know, looked the other way because the media was getting a lot of advertising from dodgy lenders and from credit card companies and banks.
Whoa. Let me ask you this. Many say America is now a banana republic, or as former Assistant Treasury Secretary Paul Craig Roberts calls it, a failed state. But the population seems almost asleep as this plunder takes place. Has the population now got the government it deserves?
Well, you know, let's not blame the people. That's too easy. You know, people are dependent on a news media that's not reporting on all of this or burying the news in the back of the paper in the business sections. We're talking about politicians who are elected with financing from Wall Street, from these very firms who have really tangled them up in a web of conflicts of interest very, very, you know, kind of smartly. And as a result, neutering any attempt of oversight or regulation and the like. So the public really, you know, gets a little small piece of information about this. They really don't know what's going on. If their, you know, individual bank accounts are going up, if they're getting good, quote, deals, then they tend to feel like everybody else is and not to worry about it. But of course, just like in a Ponzi scheme, you're making a fortune until you're not. And in this case, the American people were deluded, basically, and abused, and, you know, into buying into mortgages they couldn't sustain and couldn't afford, from sellers who knew they couldn't afford it. So this was deliberate. It was done by design, and yet it is yet to be untangled. It's yet to be really investigated. In fact, what's happening is that instead of a reform package, what we have is an attempt at a rescue by financing the very institutions that created the problem in the first place.
Danny, you're a well-known media activist. Danny Schechter, the news dissector. What role did the media play in allowing for this catastrophe to unfold? Did the media actually enable the fraud to happen? Is the financial media as embedded in the chicanery of Wall Street as the mainstream media is embedded in the cover-ups in various places like Iraq?
Well, I see media complicity as part of this crime. Media, people looking the other way. Don't forget, the media itself is having a financial crisis. Tremendous waves of layoffs and cutbacks inside the media. You know, a refusal to do the kind of investigative reporting or lack of capacity to do it over years. So as this crisis developed, a lot of the people who were reporting on business wanted to be part of business. They identified with business. They were embedded in the Wall Street narrative, in the corporate culture. And as a consequence, they didn't see what was going on or didn't want to see what was going on. I think the media has a lot of responsibility for not warning us about this and not investigating it.
Finally, Danny Schechter, you envision a debt-free future. But the financial criminals that push the debt own the government. So how is a debt-free future possible?
I wish I could see a debt-free future. I made a film called In Debt We Trust back in 2006, warning of this crisis, and in which I was basically greeted with a response that said I was a doom and gloomer, I was an alarmist, I was exaggerating. There was a wall of denial about all of this. Now the debt crisis is even deeper and more significant, tying us up really for decades to come. It's hard to see an America that's not imprisoned by debt, and Americans that are not imprisoned by, various not only mortgages, but student loans, car loans, and the rest of it. In a way, capitalism has moved backwards, not forwards, back to feudalism, where we've become serfs, we've become prisoners of our loans.
Thanks, Danny. That's all the time we have this week. I want to thank my other guest, Stacy Herbert, and we'll be back next week with much more of the Keiser Report. Until then, bye, y'all.